All right, so now we've covered the buyer side of the market with consumer surplus and willingness to pay. We can now talk about the seller side of the market, which is going to be about producer surplus. So just like we had buyers thinking about the demand curve and their willingness to pay, we're going to think of the supply curve as the willingness to sell. So think of that as like all the costs of production, including opportunity costs. So that's what it's costing them to produce. So that's what they're willing to sell it for. So think of that as being represented by the supply curve. Now, again, let's think of an example, and we'll do our tutoring example again. But now we're at the other side of the market, so we're thinking about the sellers. So we have sellers of tutoring, and we have willingness to sell. So this is, they need to get more than their willingness to sell to be able to actually enter the market and want to exchange goods. So let's think about three different people. So we can have Jenny. Jenny's willing to tutor if she gets $25 an hour. We have Kwame. They're willing to tutor if they get $20 an hour. And then we have Tristan. And they're willing to tutor if they get $15 an hour. So in terms of willingness to sell, that means Tristan's going to be willing to sell their product as long as they get a price above $15 an hour. And Kwame is willing to sell their tutoring services if they get at least $20 per hour to tutor. And then same thing for Jenny, but $25. And so what producer surplus is here put a colon there, is going to be the difference between the actual price the actual price that this good gets exchanged for, and the willingness to sell. So for instance, let's say the price was $18 an hour. Well, $18 an hour, Tristan's willing to supply their tutoring services because they are willing to supply for only $15 an hour. But that's not enough money for Kwame or Jenny to tutor. So only Tristan willing to tutor at that price, and their producer surplus is going to be that price, so 18 minus their willingness to pay, 15, so $3. Now let's say another example would be the price was $22 an hour. Let's say that's the going rate for tutoring at Queen's or on campus or online or whatever. Well, now, both Tristan and Kwame are willing to tutor. Since that's above both of their willingness to sell. And the producer surplus for Tristan has gone up. So the price has gone up, and we're going to notice the producer surplus for Tristan has gone up. So now the price is $22 an hour. They're willing to do it for $15, so it's now $7 in producer surplus for Tristan. And in terms of Kwame, their willing to sell was 20, but they get 22, so 22 minus 20 is $2. So if you want to think of the total producer surplus, it's going to be those two numbers added together. But again, now let's think about what this looks like graphically. Just like we did with consumer surplus. And the demand curve, we're going to use the supply curve and the price to kind of illustrate producer surplus. So let's take a look. So let's graphically look at this market for tutoring again, but this time from the just on the supplier side of things or the seller side of things. So here's our market, here's the price of tutoring, here's the quantity, so here's tutoring. Now, if you remember, we had Jenny, Kwame, and Tristan, and no one was willing to tutor until the price was at least 15, and then there's one person was willing to tutor, and that was Tristan. And then the second person, Kwame, was only willing to tutor if the price was above 20. And then Jenny wasn't willing to tutor unless she got at least $25 per hour for tutoring. So here, just like we had this kind of strange stepwise demand function before, we had this kind of stepwise function above, supply function here. And now we're going to think about, so we had two prices. We had, remember the prices were $18. So let's say P0, and then it went up to $22. And so let's think about what graphically the producer surplus looks like here. So $18 is, let's say this was the price of the good, P0. And so the producer surplus is going to be the difference between the price, so below the price, above this supply curve. So I should label this as the supply curve, I guess. And so that's this area here. And again, if we wanted to calculate this, the area here, you could just do the formula for the area of a rectangle, right? So this is going to be 1 times, if this price is 18, 1 times 3, because the difference between 18 and 15 is 3. So the area there is 3. And we talked about the price going up to $22. Well, again, the producer surplus is everything below the supply curve, above the supply curve and below the price. Well, now that has, just trying to think of a color that's going to show up. So now Kwame has started tutoring. So we have this extra area of producer surplus from Kwame tutoring. But we also see that the price going up increases the producer surplus, as we just kind of saw over here before, increases the producer surplus for Tristan, who is already in the market. And so again, below the price, above the supply curve. So when the price goes up, there's 2 reasons why producer surplus is going to increase. One, because existing sellers are getting a higher price and thus increasing their producer surplus. And the second reason is at higher prices, more sellers are willing to sell the product. And so that's this Kwame area right here that we talked about. So just this area here. So again, now let's look again at our kind of our regular looking supply curve. So here's our supply curve. And we can think about, again, about different prices. So let's say this is P0. Producer surplus, everything below price, above the supply curve. Below price, above supply curve. But again, only on the number of units we actually sell. And that's going to be really important when we think about government intervention and things like that. And so just like before we saw, if the price goes up, just like on this side over here, the price goes up, producer surplus is going to go up. And it's going to go up for 2 reasons, just like it went up for 2 reasons over there. One is that new buyers are entering this market. So for instance, Kwame was entering this market here. All these, sellers are entering the market, just like all these sellers are entering the market here. And the second reason is existing sellers are getting a higher price and thus increasing their producer surplus. So consumer surplus, below the demand curve, above the price. That's consumer surplus, below the demand curve, above the price. Producer surplus, below the price, above the supply curve. And these two things together are going to equal total surplus, which we'll talk about now.